Romania's defense ministry confirmed this week that some U.S. troops rotating out of the country will not be replaced, part of Washington's plan to reduce its military presence along NATO's eastern flank. For decades, Europe's security has heavily relied on American military power. The troop reductions now raise difficult questions about whether Europe can maintain its deterrence capabilities and fill potential gaps in defense infrastructure. From Berlin, DW's Arthur Sullivan explains what this U.S. announcement means for NATO and how it could reshape Europe's security strategy.
Yeah, so this news wasn't so much announced by the US as confirmed by the US. So originating with Romania's defense minister, he said that the US had briefed it and other European NATO allies that it would be redeploying a rotating brigade of troops that has been deployed in Romania, Germany, Poland and several other countries near NATO's Eastern European flank since the invasion of Ukraine over 3.5 years ago by Russia. Now, US Army Command in Europe has since officially confirmed this news with a quite brief statement, not very detailed. Now, the exact number of troops returning to the US has not been confirmed. Some reports have suggested around 700, but others suggest it is likely to be several thousand. And the numbers have not been confirmed by the US, but it did confirm in that statement that it is redeploying the entire combat team from European service from this rotating brigade. Now, the US statement did play down the significance of this move. It said, quote, "This is not an American withdrawal from Europe or a signal of lessened commitment to NATO." And it emphasised that the decision should be seen as a reflection of its increased confidence in Europe's growing military capacity. And it also did say that it was part of a process to ensure what it called a balanced military force posture. That was an apparent reference to its long-sighted plans in the US to pivot its military commitments more towards the Asia-Pacific and also possibly towards issues at its own border and towards its recently stepped-up campaign against drug trafficking into the US. Well, the US is obviously key to European security, and in that context, the numbers are important here. But as I said, we don't know the exact number of troops being pulled. The US hasn't confirmed the number. But it's still going to be a significant number, and symbolically it's important. Now, given that these troops were specifically deployed to European NATO members following that invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that was as a show of support at the time amid deep tensions and fear. So the removal in that context is raising eyebrows. Although European officials have played down the news, they've even pointed out, and they're right to point out, that there are still more US troops and more NATO troops in total on European soil, and particularly on that eastern flank, than there were before the invasion. So the US is estimated to have around 84,000 troops at the moment stationed across Europe, certainly as of earlier this year. But that number does fluctuate anyway regularly because of rotations and different military exercises. So in that context, whatever the current number is, assuming it is no more than a few thousand, it's not a major withdrawal. But the worry is that it could be the start of a process that could see far higher numbers pulled. And that's part of a fear, because the Trump administration has repeatedly threatened to reduce its support for Europe's defence. And while that commitment from the US to NATO does appear to have been strengthened in recent months, few in European security circles would be shocked if the US were to pull more troops into the future. Well, the US statement did quite pointedly refer to Europe's increased defence and military capacity, and there is no doubt that Europe's NATO members have really stepped up their commitment to their own security over the last couple of years. Mostly, it has to be said, due to the prompting and prodding of President Donald Trump. So the alliance's 32 members, the vast majority of which are European, they agreed earlier this year to increase defence spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. That's a huge increase, and many have already made major spending hikes on defence since that invasion in 2022. And just in general, Europe's posture on this issue has completely shifted. To give you a very quick example, there were reports earlier this week of the European Commission, that's the body that runs the EU, national governments and NATO formulating plans as to how Europe and their governments would use their different transit systems from rail to road to sea to collectively carry tanks and artillery across the continent in the event of war. That's kind of unthinkable planning that we wouldn't have considered a few years ago, which is now very much part of daily European agendas. But to answer that question, can Europe itself defend itself? Well, it depends from what exactly. So at the moment, one of the main issues we're seeing are these drone incursions, suspected to be orchestrated by Russia, regularly disrupting European airspace. Now, those kind of threats Europe can clearly defend itself from. But were some countries on the NATO eastern flank to face the kind of aggression and war which Ukraine has, so that's a ground troop invasion, aerial bombardment every day, attacks on critical infrastructure, well, that would be a completely different picture, especially when we consider that some of these countries are much, much smaller than Ukraine. So Europe obviously wants the US to be there for it in such an extreme scenario, but increasingly it seems that it needs to be prepared for the possibility that it may not always be there.